I don't know. Did you think they watched it over in Russia where this voice echoed through the wilderness?
The big story, the big story, the big story, the big story.
Yes, it's time, everybody. Let's get right to it. The big story from our pal. You know him. He is the man. He is, of course, Joe Piscopo, live Saturday night. You know what? It's Saturday night news.
The big story, the big story, the big story, the big story.
And since it technically already is Saturday in Russia, we're going to go right over to our news notes, everybody, and check everything out for you. And hopefully you'll find a lot of these things resonating with you, and I'll be able to engender and ask you for your comments, because a couple of these items, I scratched my head with the Russians when we had our meetings, our production meetings today. And I said, hey, Russians, this is a little confusing. Can you help me out here? So if we go over to the news notes, you'll see the big story, and that is Ukraine. Ukraine on the brain. So let's get a little something special. Rather than doing our warfare coverage and things like that, I want to go a little more Christmas theme again. I've got something that I think you might enjoy. And, you know, I've been putting together some of those Christmas box things, and we've got a new one for you. This goes international, maybe not all the way over to Ukraine, but there is some Russian footage in here. Here we go. I think you'll enjoy it. Merry Christmas, everybody, and I hope you're going to be getting together with friends and family, and whatever day you might want to celebrate the birth of Christ. Just remind some people who might be materialists, you can't get the physical world from the physical world. The physical world, physics has to come by definition from something non-physical, metaphysical. So that's maybe a first step in the right direction for people. All right. So we have two vectors to explore here on Ukraine. As I mentioned, we've got the EU vector and there's an American vector. I want to start with the American vector because this is an American-based show, even though, of course, we're in a Moscow bunker, and discuss something that I was going to bring up last night, and I don't think I really expressed it. As you know, I have been saying for a while that Donald Trump's his rhetoric about wanting peace in Ukraine and wanting to stop all the bloodshed does not comport with his actions, and that he could have stopped it long ago. He actually has basically no power over Russia in any way. Russia is doing things militarily. The Putin is doing what he needs to do militarily. And every time they have these negotiations, there's a big, big promotion, and the U.S. government ends up giving more money to Ukraine. Donald Trump said that he was done giving weapons to Ukraine and all done, and he wanted the Europeans to support NATO more. But what he didn't tell people was that even though the United States supposedly was not going to give weapons to Ukraine anymore, not going to fund all that stuff, he was going to have NATO buy the weapons. He didn't tell people that the United States provides 68 to 70% of NATO's military budget. There you go. So again, he's deceiving people, just like he was deceiving people about the economy when he spoke. So that's a very important thing to recall, whether it's his Wednesday night address where he claimed that the economy was doing great and lied through his teeth about things like gas prices and all sorts of nonsense, or it's about Ukraine. You're still paying for those weapons. On top of that, he signed the National Defense Authorization Act. It's a yearly proposal that almost always passes. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen a year when it hasn't passed. It's one of these they call must-pass bills. It's filled with pork, and if you oppose it in Congress, then you are in opposition to the great sacrifice of our soldiers. And of course, everyone will argue over what our soldiers should be doing in various places, whether women should be doing this or that inside ours. It's the tragedy of the commons in blue and green fatigues and Air Force uniforms. So all those things come into play when you're trying to learn lessons about these things. But the immediacy of Trump signing the NDAA should be an alarm bell to most people who perhaps are watching this show or watching other people like the Ron Paul Liberty Report and Daniel McAdams, or other people like Douglas McGregor, or other folks like Judge Napolitano or Anti-War and Dave DeCamp at Midnight, and recognize that Donald Trump signed the NDAA despite, again, his rhetoric that no more weapons were going to go to Ukraine. Because inside the NDAA is a manifest $400 million package to send weapons to Ukraine, plus another $400 million. And Douglas McGregor spoke about that. So first, let me show you some of the information that we've got here about Ukraine. Trump signed the NDAA with $400 million and $400 million. And Douglas McGregor, a good man, a military man, said this: Trump signs $1 trillion defense bill, includes $800 million for Ukraine. Trump approves hundreds of millions in military spending for Ukraine, continuing Biden-era flow of weapons and munitions. So as we get together and have hopefully a comfortable time, talking about these stories, and it's a little different type of streaming show here in Liberty Conspiracy, offering the opportunity for you to give me your opinions on this. Do you think I was off base there in saying that Donald Trump? I don't think I was being unfair. I think I was seeing signals, and of course he was not going to stop it, right? And Douglas McGregor, I'm sure he knew tens of thousands of U.S. troops are going to remain in Europe. And he says, and this all continues uninterrupted. The U.S. continues overseeing all military operations in Ukraine via its military base in Germany, while the U.S. CIA oversees Ukraine's intelligence agencies and operations, including strikes inside Russia and on Russian energy exports at sea. We've got more information on that because I have two things, and I want to find out more. I've only got preliminary information. I heard first today that Ukraine hit a Chinese tanker that was going to be carrying Russian oil. Then I heard that the Ukrainians hit a Russian tanker. So there's some confusion there. I won't talk any more about it until I find out more about it. But maybe somebody else knows more about this. And that just was something that I saw later in the afternoon about it being a Russian tanker rather than the Chinese. And Douglas McGregor says this: talk of peace is simply to force Russia into a Minsk 3.0 style freeze the U.S. can use to rearm both Ukraine and Europe and restart hostilities later, and in the meantime focus on containing Russia's ally, China, especially as Douglas McGregor is picking up in South America and in Central America. So it does look like their long-term strategy against China is starting to become very clear to people who are very skeptical of U.S. so-called peace because it's non-existent. And it does seem clear that the United States administration is speaking out of both ends of its so-called hat. So we're going to go into the Ukraine funding thing in just a minute, but I want to show you Daniel McAdams. Daniel McAdams had some, I think, pretty strong words about this. He has this. Why did the president veto? Why didn't the president veto the NDAA, which contained 800 million for the thieves in Kiev? Now, I've recorded this. This is actually pretty low-level audio of Marco Rubio saying, this is not our war. It's a war on another continent. And so let me get this all queued up for you because I think you'll find this entertaining, as the psychedelic furs might say, entertain me, right? Check this out because, yeah, there is something to this. Daniel McAdams makes a pretty darn good point. Let me see if I can find it here for you. Let's see. Okay. Yep. Okay. Okay. As long as the system doesn't crash on me, I've got a lot of files running here. All right. So this is the one from Rubio. And what's great is somebody on X posted something that is just, it's just beautiful. Okay. So I'm going to call this up here. Now, this is fairly quiet. Okay. So let me get this out here for you and make it, as they would say, the cat, make it big for you. Mr. Rubio. Now, he says, this is not our war, okay? All right, so here's what Rubio had to say. This is just a beautiful thing. It's still fairly quiet, but I brought it up a little bit.
Actually talk to both sides and figure out whether...
Here we go.
...on Earth. There's only one entity on Earth. Clear about this. I mean, the United States is engaged in this. The president says this, and I'll translate what I think, he's trying to say to you in all of this, and I think he's been pretty clear about it, is it's not our war. It's a war in another continent. We have equities. We have engagement in this war, but it's not our war per se. But we have been told by everybody. I think
it's not our war, he says. It's not our war. It's a war on another continent. Oh, okay. All right, if you say so. Well, let's watch that again. And this time, let's see someone's response.
What I think, he's trying to say to you in all of this, and I think he's been pretty clear about it, is it's not our war. It's a war in another continent. We have equities. We have engagement in this war, but it's not our war per se. But we have been told by everybody. I think everybody would agree that there's only one nation on Earth. There's only one entity on Earth that can actually talk to both sides and figure out whether there's a way to end this war peacefully. And that's the United States. Clear about this. I mean, the United States is engaged in this. The president says this, and I'll translate what I think, he's trying to say to you in all of this, and I think he's been pretty clear about it, is it's not our war. It's a war in another continent. We have equities. We have engagement in this war, but it's not our war per se. But we have been told by everybody. I think everybody would agree that there's only one nation on Earth. There's only one entity on Earth that can actually talk to both sides. And
oh, yeah, there you go. This is a response. Venezuela is also on another continent. And it took a little while to get to the payoff. But it was perfect. Just classic. Yes, absolutely right, Marco, Mr. Rubio. Unbelievable. All right, so let's get into the details about the United States and about the EU. So let me give you some of the other information here about this. Okay, we're going to go to the news notes about the European decision. The EU leadership gang has dropped its attempt to subsidize Euroclear to take 200 billion euros of Russian assets deposited in the bank and then hand them to Ukraine. Instead, they voted today to have each member nation cough up more loans to Ukraine. So here's the information coming to us. Aaron Mate has this, and it's pretty straight up. To keep the Ukraine proxy war going, the EU faced a tough choice: steal Russian assets and risk legal consequences for themselves, or steal from their own populations and put the burden on them. They chose the latter. So here's the AP headline. You can see, and it links over to the AP news story. European Union leaders have agreed to provide an interest-free loan of 90 billion euros to Ukraine to meet its military and economic needs for the next 2 years. Now, we're going to go into further details on that in just a minute, but I want to show you this. Hungary, Slovakia, and oops, hold on just a minute. Sorry, I got the wrong link in there. Hungary, Slovakia, and Czechia stood against the original idea to do it via Euroclear. And Viktor Orban has some very key comments that we'll show you in a second. So here's Che Bose. Neither Hungary, Slovakia, or Chechnya will help fund Ukraine via the so-called EU loan agreed last night. That's a big deal. They got enough involved that the populations of these countries were large enough because they weren't going to allow small European nations to really have any effect on the vote. It was going to be weighted on population. But this time, Orban pulled through. Hungary pulled through. He speaks a good game, and this time they pulled through. So the EU Euroclear connection is not going to happen, but they're still going to be doing it through their own central banks. At least it looks like they're going to try to do this. Now, if you watch the judges' Intel roundtable today, Ray McGovern seemed pretty sanguine about it. He seemed pretty positive that this is going to be the end and things are going to wind down and the Europeans are going to have to back off because they just don't have the money coming from their separate countries to back this loan. Well, as I mentioned, if I were there amongst the group, I would say, but Ray, they've already been doing this sort of thing and they're already in massive debt. The United States does this sort of thing and it is in massive debt. They'll just borrow more. They don't care. As long as their friends and they themselves and their wallets are doing fine, they don't care about the civilians and the buying power of their monetary unit in their home countries. And as long as they can connect to enough people to give them money to get reelected, they're fine. The only time it would come into, raise a problem for them is if they weren't getting that feedback loop to make sure they could stay in office, but they're going to get it. They borrow the money, they give it to the arms manufacturers. The arms manufacturers give them money to get reelected. They get reelected. And the civilians suffer. So I don't see an end to this. I don't see an end to this. The end to it is not going to come from the Europeans saying, we've exhausted our ability to be able to debt finance the Ukrainians. That's what they've been doing, whether it's through Euroclear, the ECB, or through their own countries. They do it all the time with their own national budgets. That's what the U.S. does. It's not as if they haven't seen the precedent already and continue to march on that debt-ridden path. As long as it greases their own personal gears, they'll continue to do it at the expense of tons and tons of people in every country. Millions and millions of people seeing their livelihoods destroyed by the inflation of their money supplies. They'll just keep doing it. The thing that's going to end it is going to be Russia. Militarily, that's going to be the end of it. And today, Vladimir Putin did his multi-hour, many people question and answer anniversary at the end of the year question and answer session. And it was revelatory. It was phenomenal. We've got some clips to show you. I think you'll like those. So Orban has some very, very strong comments about this. And again, he has spoken a good game, but this time he backed it up. So here's what he says to put a punctuation mark on at least his nation's involvement and his ability to stop the EU from getting that Brussels Euroclear bank to seize those Russian assets. Again, the assets will not be completely stolen. They're still going to be hung up. They won't be handed over to Ukraine. Instead, the EU has decided to make it a 90 billion loan to Ukraine via the separate European countries. Okay, so here's what Orban had to say as this finished off. He says, "We have endured a long and challenging night. We managed to avert the immediate risk of war. We did not allow Europe to issue a declaration of war on Russia by using Russian assets. This plan would have dragged Europe into war and imposed a financial burden of 1,000 billion HUF on Hungary. We succeeded in protecting Hungarian families from this. At the same time, 24 member states decided to grant a war loan to Ukraine for the next 2 years. If Ukraine is unable to repay the loan, those European countries will have to cover the repayment. Thankfully, the V3 cooperation is active once again. That would be Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic. They have decided not to get on that train. By doing so, we spared our children and grandchildren from the burden of this massive $90 billion loan. So they're not involved, keep it in mind. And they also helped prevent this larger ECB robbery. Hungary's share of the war loan would have been more than 400 billion HUF. The bad news is that war reparations are clearly continuing in Brussels. Hungary remains the voice of peace in Europe and will not let Hungarian taxpayers' money be used to finance Ukraine. Only a government of patriots can guarantee peace and ensure that Hungarian funds are not sent to Ukraine. If there were a Brazilian government in Hungary, they would push Hungary into war and spend every last dime on supporting Ukraine. We cannot and will not allow this to happen. Now, as disappointed as I've been by Orban's stark difference between his rhetoric and his actions, this is a moment that has averted a major conflict. This is a big, big deal in world history. What he just said right there is going to go into the history books, I think. And, that might sound highfalutin or whatever in a materialist-based world that doesn't mean a lot. It's the soul that's really, really counts. But Viktor Orban stood up finally, and that statement will go into the history books. That statement prevented the EU from pushing all of Europe closer to world war with Russia. And Donald Trump should wake up and recognize that as much as the Russians are saying kind things about, well, we think Donald Trump really does want peace, I hope he understands that they know he's not acting as if he wants peace. Certainly not with his NATO shell game. They know, just like we know here on this show, that the bulk of the NATO defense budget is provided by the U.S., and that's not changing. The Russians know that. They know they can't trust Mr. Trump, and they're going to finish this militarily. That's the way it's going to go. And Viktor Orban knows it, and they made the right choice last night, late night. Very important. Very important. That's a big, big deal. So again, everybody, the outcome of it, just to give you that secondary punctuation, we'll make it an ellipsis, right? European Union leaders, except for those countries that said we're out of it, that you just saw Orban mention, have agreed to provide an interest-free loan of 90 billion euros to Ukraine to meet its military and economic needs for the next 2 years. After 2 years, it's going to have to be repaid, but you can bet what they're trying to do in the EU is give themselves more room to vote for a repayment schedule change or a way to give them more money. And maybe the United States will pull through and do it. Who knows? But again, we've got Douglas McGregor speaking very well about the reality of the Trump administration. We've got Viktor Orban speaking very well about the reality for his country and also for other countries that got involved and stopped this, including, again, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. Good for them. Good for them. Now, on the other side of this, I wanted to mention Putin held his annual press Q&A for many hours, and he answered a foolish question from an NBC reporter that we'll play for you in just a minute. I've got to fix the volume or bring it up a little bit. Here is Putin's traditional year-end press conference as it happened. The Russian president spoke for 4.5 hours and discussed more than 70 different topics. It was amazing to watch. Putin fielded questions from a total of more than 2 million submitted by the public, speaking for 4.5 hours. The president is estimated to have touched upon more than 70 different topics, including the Ukraine conflict and questions related to Russian frontline soldiers and their families. And he knows a lot about that. And domestic issues as well as broader geopolitics. He concluded the press conference after discussing things such as AI and the threats of privacy, the Ukraine conflict, He says that if Kiev is to hold an election, Moscow will demand that Ukrainian citizens currently living in Russia, of which there are between 5 and 10 million, according to various estimates, are also allowed to participate. Quote, the government in Ukraine must become legitimate, and without an election, that is impossible, Putin stresses. Again, they have some pretty strong points that I wish the Americans would acknowledge, which is that Zelensky is not the valid president. If he engages with Russia in negotiations and they come to an agreement, then it's possible that a future Ukrainian so-called head of state could say, well, that's not valid, right? So they've got to nail that down. That's just a matter of honesty, right? Again, I'm an anarchist, but, as far as those international relations things go, I think that's pretty manifest, right? The other part of it is there is not going to be any NATO membership and no NATO-like membership of Article 5 protection. If the Russians end up coming to a peace agreement because Kiev asks for it, the key thing for the Russians is that there will be an international peacekeeping group that includes Russians inside Ukraine for an X number of years, that Ukraine will not have a 600,000 member army nor an 800,000 member army or anything like that. That's not going to happen. All the land that the Russians have taken so far in the Donbass will remain with Russia. Crimea will go with Russia. Odessa, of course, will go with Russia. And those areas that the Russians have taken over the past few weeks may be negotiated. But they're not going to kowtow to all this other nonsense that the Europeans keep bringing up and delaying things. And they're not going to go with a ceasefire. There's no reason. The Russians are in the driver's seat, as the song might say. Now, this NBC hack asked a question. Now, I've got to get this prepped because it was so quiet, and I just recorded it towards the end of the day. So let me make sure that I've got this all set for you here. It is this one. Yeah, it's very, very quiet. I've got to amplify this. So let me bring it up here for you. In fact, I'm going to have to do an extra special thing. The Russians, you ready, Russians? Okay, cool. I'm going to go with this. Okay, good. And we're going to bring this in, and I've got to really ramp it up. I've got a special thing here that we can do to get this volume even louder, because this was one of the dumbest questions. And a lot of people noticed it coming from NBC, from the pro-Zionist NBC and the anti-Russian NBC. Let me bring this up here for you. Okay, this ought to do it. I think this ought to do it. All right, so right on. It was amazing. And people did describe this guy as pompous, and they nailed it 100%. So let me go with this. All right, here we go. Here he is. I don't even know who this host guy is, but check it out. It's unbelievable.
About relations with President Trump and the United States. President Trump has a peace deal on the table. Ukraine is offering enormous about relations with President Trump and the United States. President Trump has a peace deal on the table. Ukraine is offering enormous compromises. Yet you continue to talk of war. Mr. President, if you reject President Trump's peace offer, will you be responsible for the deaths of Ukrainians and Russians in 2026?
So let's just say, he says, and again, it's very, very soft, but I wanted to get that out there. And, hopefully you can turn it up if you're watching after the fact. I wanted to include it in the show. I had to decide, am I going to include this or not include it? The very premise of what that guy is saying, Ukraine has offered amazing concessions. First of all, it's not the legitimate government of Ukraine. Okay, this follows years of illegitimate governments in Ukraine after the United States overthrew Yanukovych in late 2014. Second, they have not offered dramatic concessions in any way. What the Ukrainians have been doing is offering ceasefire proposal after ceasefire proposal while Zelensky heads over to Europe or meets with Americans like Lindsey Graham in Ukraine to ask for more money and more weapons, which he is continuing to get. He's not offering and asking for a peace and saying, you know what, we will offer you this. He's offered nothing. The only thing he has offered are things that the Russians consistently from day one have said, we are attacking you because you're trying to go for these things. So they offer so-called a ceasefire. They don't want a ceasefire in Russia because that's a rearmament period. They want either victory or defeat. That's all. And the reason they have to do this is because the Ukrainians attach themselves to an expansionist NATO, and the Russians don't want NATO in Ukraine. And so when they offer the concession of a ceasefire, that's out to lunch. When they offer a so-called concession of, we'll just not go into NATO, but we'll kind of be in NATO anyway, that, of course, is stupid and dumb, and it shouldn't even be brought up. So you're insulting everybody in the room, dude. When you say dumb things like that, you're embarrassing yourself. How dare you use money from a network to go over there and waste people's time getting up and asking something that has such faulty premises? Utter lying. You are contributing to falsehoods with your question.
We do not consider ourselves responsible for the death of people. It wasn't us who started this war. This war began after the coup d'etat, anti-constitutional coup d'etat, armed coup d'etat that happened in 2014, and the start of fighting on the part of the Kiev regime heads against their own people in the southeast of Ukraine. On our part, we stopped short of recognizing the autonomy and independence of the then breakaway republics of Donetsk and Lugansk. And after we had been deceived and the Minsk arrangements hadn't been implemented, we had to resort to the armed forces to conclude that war that had been started by the Kiev regime with the support of the Western countries.
Exactly. Don't forget, everybody. Late 2013, they overthrow Yanukovych. They put in a new government early 2014. Early 2014, that new government sends pro-Nazi forces connected to the Svoboda Party and the Azov Brigade into the Donbass region, down towards down towards Odessa and Crimea. The Russians have an agreement that the Russians are supposed to be able to handle the Crimean ports. That triggers Putin to have to go down to protect Crimea and the Crimean Bridge. Then Obama in March of 14 uses that as a pretext to issue, and you can look it up. It was March of 2014, an executive order claiming that the Russians are the aggressors. Roosevelt would be proud, don't you think? Lincoln would have been delighted. It's basically a Fort Sumter situation. So the Russians go down. They're trying to protect these ethnically Russian people. And we've shown you footage in that late winter, early spring of 2014, when the Ukrainian government bombed those oblasts in the Donbass. They started killing people. That is when this started. And Vladimir Putin and the Russians, they waited and waited and waited a long time. After already seeing nefarious and illegal actions by the United States and Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Pyatt and Lindsey Graham and John McCain and Joe Biden and Amy Klobuchar and Chris Murphy and so many other Americans who went over there in late 2013, and you probably have seen the footage in early 2014, after the CIA and Soros groups worked to create a false flag with the Maidan coup, shooting innocent people in Kiev and then blaming it on Yanukovych, which he did not do that. That inspires a revolution, and McCain and Jeffrey Pyatt and Victoria Nuland are out there nighttime looking through the glass of a high-rise building in Kiev, watching the new government come together, and you get the phone call between Pyatt and Victoria Nuland. It's her famous F the EU phone call, and that was what brought the focus, where the real substance is them discussing that they're going to put in Yatsenyuk to lead the country with the backing of people like, you got it, Johnny Bach. It's right in front of us. It's a book. It's already been written. All we have to do is look at it. And this guy from NBC wants to perpetuate a lie. I hope if he runs around and is covering presidential stuff in New Hampshire sometime, I hope I bump into that guy and I've got a phone and I can ask him, how do you feel overtly deceiving people in a question in front of Vladimir Putin, in front of so many Russians who actually knew the truth? Was that embarrassing for you, or did you have no problem doing that and then going back to work at NBC? It's just disgusting. What a complete hack. Unbelievable. Now, Putin also tried to set NATO head Rutte on the right track. Here's what Putin had to say to Mark Rutte, and it was perfect. Putin on Rutte. What are you talking about when you talk about preparing for war with Russia? Can you read? Check this out.
Что ты говоришь про войну с Россией? Готовиться нужно к войне с Россией.
He says, I'm going to bring the volume down, just read it for you here. But here it is. He says, what are you saying when about war with Russia? We need to prepare for war with Russia. They want to prepare for war with Russia? Can you read? Read the new national security strategy of the United States. What does it say? The United States, and I draw your attention to this, is the key player in NATO. The United States created NATO, and it is its main sponsor. All the basic resources come from the United States. Money, military technology, weapons, ammunition, everything comes from there. This is the foundation. Now watch this, everybody, in the new national security strategy. Now watch as Putin makes reference to the United States saying that they're not going to back any more aggression through NATO. But what Putin doesn't say is what I've been saying, and what we know, that the bulk of the national defense, of the NATO defense, comes from the United States. So the rhetoric of the United States is what Putin is saying here out front. I would love to talk to him to see whether or not he would agree with me to say the U.S. rhetoric is different from its actions within NATO. But we'll continue. He says, in the new NATO security strategy, Russia is not designated as an enemy. And he makes a good point here to Mark Rutte, or as a target. Yet the NATO security general is preparing for war with us. What is this? Can you read? How are you pushing NATO for a war with Russia when the main NATO country does not consider us an adversary or enemy? It's just that I don't even know. The level of professional competence in this position is insufficient. Now, we're going to repeat this with some footage from Judge Andrew Napolitano on his weekly Intel wrap-up. I recorded it, and I want to give it to you. I think you'll find it worthwhile. And he played this and a number of other very valuable segments. So we're going to head on over here and check it out with Larry and Ray McGovern doing great stuff. And they talked about how during his question and answer period, Putin actually sounded pretty upbeat. So here is this. This is a great overview from the judge, Larry Johnson, and Ray McGovern.
that Cy Hirsch says he's in. I don't think, I don't think Putin would be this happy and jocular about Zelensky.
Why do we keep repeating the same mistakes when it comes to military?
Sorry, I'll hop through this. I'm just going to go through. I forgot I didn't edit that out. Okay, here we go. Okay, perfect. Okay.
It's because we stopped studying.
I'm saying this without any...
Putin would be this happy and jocular about Zelensky. Watch this. This is from just 3 or 4 hours ago. Chris, cut number 4.
A writer, an artist, a talented person. I'm saying this without any irony. We know this from his films back in the old days. So there's nothing unusual about it here. Well, they say the Stele looks completely different now, but that's not the point. The Stele is located about a kilometer away from the city itself.
So why stand on the threshold? Come on in.
Now, that is a reference to Zelensky claiming to be outside of a city that, or sort of inside a city, that the Russians have taken, and claiming that the Russians hadn't taken the city. Watch this.
That's right. Well, if Kupiansk is already under their control.
I guess he was sort of taunting Zelensky there. He did speak, of course, with far more seriousness when he was responding to Mark Ruda. We'll play that one as well. Chris, cut number 6.
Why are you talking about a war with Russia? We need to prepare for a war with Russia. They want to prepare for a war with Russia. Well, can you read the new U.S. national security strategy? What does it say? The U.S., I want to point out, is the key player in NATO. The U.S. created NATO, is its main sponsor, and all the main resources come from the U.S. Both money and technology, military equipment, weapons and ammunition, all of it comes from there. This is the foundation in the new NATO's comprehensive national security strategy. However, Russia is currently not explicitly listed as a direct enemy, and this stance is subject to ongoing review. As a target, but the NATO Secretary General is preparing for war with us. What is that supposed to mean? But can you read? How can you say that NATO is preparing for war with Russia if the main NATO member doesn't consider us an adversary or enemy? It's just, I don't know, even the level of professional competence in this position is insufficient.
Larry, that's the most significant part of the national security strategy. Russia is not the enemy. Russia is somebody we want to do business with. I don't know what's going to happen in Mar-a-Lago or Miami, wherever they're meeting in South Florida. These two clowns sat on their hands while Chancellor Merz told everybody NATO would still be in Ukraine, and Ukraine would have an 800,000-man army, and Russia would have its military equipment, demilitarized zone in a portion of Russia. They just didn't object to it.
Well, wait a second. Let me intervene here. They sat on their hands. Look, the game is for them to keep their mouths shut, not offend the Europeans, and be able to come back and say, look, we listened to them really carefully, but when Dmitriev arrives tomorrow, they're going to forget all about that. Because
So let's pause it here. Again, and this is where I mentioned Ray McGovern's much more sanguine and hopeful about the situation, seeing the bulk of the European Union leaders like von der Leyen and Kaja Kallas and others, seeing Mark Rutte disappointed with NATO, but still putting out his rhetoric, but seeing that the Europeans just won't be giving this money that is inside Euroclear, and they're going to try to back it up themselves with their own separate banks inside their own countries, choosing to do it in their own countries, have the taxpayers support it because it's all about freedom, right? But he seems to think that they're going to not be able to maintain this. And I think that they will continue to try to maintain it. And also, he seems to think that, and I know other people who think the same thing, and I don't necessarily poo-poo it, but I don't think it is correct. My opinion is that people like Jared Kushner and others, well, I'll just say this, and you'll hear Ray mention it. And I don't want to prejudice anybody by speaking about what Ray's about to say first, but I do want to stress this just to emphasize this section of what we produced today for the show. And in what Ray says here, to be as fair as I can, I mean, he knows so much more than I do. He's been at this a long time and read probably 1,000 books on this and dealt with this in his work and things like that. But my instinct about Jared Kushner and Witkoff and all the rest of the people from the Trump administration who've been involved one way or another on this is when Kushner and Witkoff were silent as the Europeans wanted and said that their idea for this 20-point plan was for a ceasefire and all these things. Ray says, look, it was their place to be as neutral as possible because they know that later they're going to engage in new negotiations themselves apart from the Europeans. They want to make sure that they're still in good stead with the Europeans. So they've got to play that so they just don't oppose it, knowing it's not going to go anywhere. I understand that. But as far as it goes, I would hope that they would have a different standard, which is that they are agents of the United States. They're not supposed to be involved in any of this. And they should explicitly tell these people in Europe, we're not supposed to be doing anything. We're not giving weapons or money to NATO anymore. There's no war. And this is highly, highly dangerous to continue doing this. We know that you Europeans also know that the U.S. is paying for upwards of 70% of the NATO defense budget. And we are leaving because you continue to try to extend this and more people are going to die. Now, as Ray says, they were probably silent because they have to play good with the Europeans to keep on good graces in negotiation and international relations with them. Maybe that was the case. Maybe that was. I probably wouldn't have done that. I would have been pretty explicit.
Those are Europeans, and they don't matter anymore, and neither does Zelensky. So,
and the Europeans won't be there tomorrow.
Of course not. So they've been marginalized. So what Witkoff, and they sat there and listened only because they had to come back to the U.S. and tell Congress and tell Senator Graham and all those people, look, we listened really carefully to the Ukrainians, and it wouldn't be so funny if it hadn't happened exactly 3 weeks ago, the same sort of route. Dmitriev arrives, and then the Ukrainians will come to be briefed, and then the deal will be made. The deal will continue to be equal to...
Larry, is your view as sanguine as Ray's?
Well, yes and no. Look, unless Russia convinces Donald Trump to sign a treaty, and a treaty that is going to be submitted to the U.S. Senate and ratified by the U.S. Senate, any agreement that Donald Trump reaches with the Russians is meaningless because Trump does not have the full political support. And I guess I continue to be shocked by how penetrated the U.S. public opinion is and has been twisted against Russia and believe this mountain of lies that has been told persistently that Russia is a communist state, it's an authoritarian state, it's an imperialist state. Putin is the greatest evil the world's ever known since Adolf Hitler. In fact, he's worse than Hitler and Stalin combined, that the military's inept, incompetent, they're going to lose any minute. Now, that's not a view just held by people like Lindsey Graham and Dick Blumenthal of Connecticut. It is actually held by many in the Senate in particular and in the House of Representatives. Now, part of the sentiment of these people has been bought by the Ukrainians. You know, they've funneled millions of dollars into at least 29 members of the House and Senate.
Is Lindsey Graham corrupt? Has he been corrupted by the Ukrainians?
I believe he has. I'm told that he has been. I can't prove that. But you know, look, the corruption goes on and the misinformation, that reference to that Putin was making to Zelensky and the Stella. Zelensky, the Russians had captured Kupiansk. The Ukrainians insisted, no, they haven't. We've got it. We've got it under control. See, here's a picture of Zelensky standing next to the sign that's out on the outskirts of Kupiansk. The problem was then some curious local Ukrainians went out and filmed that location, and the sign was basically been blown up. It was damaged. So what they proved was that this was just another green screen effect where they put Zelensky in front of something, made it it's propaganda. And that's what the West continues to do best, create all this propaganda, trying to convince the public, especially in the United States, that Ukraine still has a chance. I mean, Russia, all it's going to take is another little push, just a little more pressure, and Russia's going to collapse. And that's whatever goodwill exists between the Russians and Trump. And I think it is genuine. And that's where, I agree with Ray on that. And Dmitriev has got the confidence of Witkoff and Kushner, and it's probably vice versa. But the bulk of the U.S. political establishment does not support that. Right. They support the European position. And I don't see how the Russians can put any faith or confidence in any agreement signed just with Donald Trump's broker.
Without 2/3 of the Senate ratifying. I think.
All right, so I want to pause it there and continue our coverage in just a minute. I want to get your opinions. Say hi to everybody inside Rumble. We're going to close off with a couple more minutes of Ukraine coverage. Then we're going to go into just a quick update about what the United States government has been doing in Somalia, and we'll talk a little bit about Venezuela. And then we're going to get into the plight of Hannah Dugan, the judge who now could stand 5 years in federal penitentiary just because she tried to remind the feds about the rules inside the U.S. Constitution. So we'll get back to the Larry Johnson and Judge Napolitano and Ray McGovern conversation to close things off for our conversation about Ukraine in just a minute. Let me know what you think, everybody, but I do think that Donald Trump cannot be trusted here. I think that Donald Trump knows that NATO is going to be buying a lot of weapons from those arms makers, and those arms makers are telling Donald Trump, hey, they're going to be continuing to buy our stuff, so let's keep this going as long as we can. As I say, look, if Kelly Ayotte, who's now the governor of New Hampshire, could appear on Fox News while she's on the board of Fox News and she's on the board of BAE Systems, a weapons maker, and insist a couple of years ago that Ukraine get more weapons and they don't divulge any of that stuff, I think it's pretty clear to me that the weapons maker influences inside the White House will have a similar sort of sway. I think that there's an entire world that is just operating like clockwork in there, and we can't get our hands on the machinery in any way whatsoever. Marvin Gardens. Hey, Marvin, good to see you. See you, man. Good to see you. We got Skunk Hollow is in there. Great to see you, Karen Carpenter. Karen, I hope you're feeling well. Ferb is there. Ferb, Merry Christmas early. Ferb, I hope you guys liked the opening. I really wanted to make sure that I played that for you. I know I played it before, but it was a nice way to start the show, I thought. I mean, the Russians thought that. Jason Barker. Jason, watch, everybody watch Knights of the Storm tomorrow at 2:00. It's going to be great. Going to talk to a free-minded musician. In fact, I'm going to talk to him on the 22nd. So that's going to be really cool. And let's see. Karen says hello. MOE is there. Hey, MOE, Birdhouse. Hello, hello. Merry Christmas early, guys. Thank you for being here. All right. Let's do a little bit more music, and then we're going to come back and round this off tonight. Sort of a quiet night. Settle in by the fire, get your popcorn and all that stuff, But again, breaking apart the news and trying to, can't exactly find the truth here, but a positive sign. Orban stood up, and that's not going to be happening. They dodged a bullet coming out of Ukraine. We'll give you the final thoughts on that one in just a second. Right now, I want to go with a little something nice. Here is the Music Box Joy to the World that we played a couple times so far. I like this one. right. Merry Christmas, everybody. I love the way that ends with the sun and so on out there. It looks really pretty. Good stuff. So wherever you are, thanks for being here. And as they would say, remember, wherever you go, there you are, right? Is that one of those classic Mainer statements? I'm not sure. Can't get there from here. I'm going to finish off some of this Ukraine stuff because it does look like, and in fact, I was able to confirm it during some of the breaks here. The Russians put the message in my brain chip receiver that Ukraine has hit a Russian tanker. And so I want to give you some of this information. It's called the Qendil, Qendil. And here is Brian Berletic. I don't know what Brian Berletic's background is. Says former U.S. Marine focused on geopolitics in Eurasia. So here it is. Ukraine, in quotes, multiple United States, Ukraine, who knows what else, allegedly strikes another Russian tanker, this time in the Mediterranean, in widening de facto blockade. The widening de facto blockade fits into long-standing U.S. objectives described in Rand's 2019 Extending Russia paper seeking to disrupt Russian energy exports. This is exactly what this guy told us years ago about the overthrow of Syria, how they wanted to block Russian energy. Then we saw the overthrow in late 2013 in Ukraine. They had just made an energy agreement with Russia and the replacement of the government there in 2014. And of course, the starving of Europe. And that is causing massive problems for them energy-wise with things like pipelines and oil becoming more expensive because the European leaders won't allow civilians to actually buy stuff that they could get more cheaply. The United States dollar has benefited from that, and its slide downwards has not been as precipitous because expenses for doing business in Europe have gone up and living standards have not. So here's more about this attack today. This is confirmed, everybody. A widening de facto blockade fits into long-standing U.S. objectives described in Rand's 2019 Extending Russia paper, seeking to disrupt Russian energy exports. Western media has admitted the naval drones Ukraine is using were based on U.S. systems originally developed for use against China. The U.S. is openly planning a similar blockade against China. Ukraine's intelligence services are carrying out the strikes. Services taken over and directed by the U.S. CIA since 2014, according to even the New York Times. The attacks are a U.S. operation, only possible with U.S. ISR capabilities and its global network of military bases and clandestine assets. For more information, see my full article written recently about U.S. plans for blockades. Ukraine video claims to show long-range attack on oil tanker in Mediterranean. So with that, we'll finish things off with the judge and the intel panel. Here we go.
It's a great analysis. Ray, I want your thoughts on something else President Putin said. We'll run the clip for you right now, suggesting, this is terrific, Russia and Europe should trade with each other rather than fighting with each other. So, number 5, Chris.
And if we were to join our efforts with European countries, Russia and European countries, our joint GDP would be higher than the United States. Of course, this is all theoretical, but it is quite obvious. The fact is quite obvious that unifying and complementing our abilities, we will thrive instead of fighting each other like you are doing.
How do people like Ray, Starmer, Macron, and Merz and their buddies react when the president of Russia says unifying and complementing our abilities and we will thrive instead of fighting each other?
Well, Macron yesterday said, well, maybe we ought to talk to Russia. Oh, that's the first I've heard in years. Maybe we ought to, look, the game is up. They can't have the money. They can't have the armaments. They can't have a really good deal on Ukraine. And what is possible out of all this? Well, if you look a couple of years or even a couple of months in advance, nothing is impossible. Now, I would cite John F. Kennedy at a time when communists, the atheist communism was just as bad as they came out of Russiagate, okay? What did he do? He gave a speech and he said, look, as a token of my willingness to meet Russians halfway, I'm going to do a limited test ban treaty, okay? And everybody said, yeah, right, treaty.
We'll skip over this thing. This is one of these Ukraine ads. I wasn't able to edit this out, but just had to hurry to get back here. Okay, here we go.
The treaty was ratified by the Senate. Now, it takes a little adroitness and diplomacy. Maybe Trump doesn't have that, but don't rule anything out that might come months in advance. As the national security strategy says, now it is a core principle, Russian language of the United States to have a good, substantive, strategic relationship with Russia. And the way to do that is to get the Ukrainian thing behind us. That's right.
So let me ask you, do the actions of the Ukrainians working with the Americans to hit that tanker today dovetail with the rhetoric of the Trump administration? Of course it doesn't. Of course it doesn't. It's all rhetoric, and the Russians know that it's rhetoric. They know they're going to have to do this militarily. They know they can't count on Jared Kushner or Witkoff or anybody, or Howard Lutnick or any of these other people in their offices to do anything that will actually support something that brings Russian security, especially to the Donbass region. The United States already was involved in what triggered thousands of people getting killed in the Donbass. Putin knows what's going on. Putin is offering statements to counter Ruta, knowing at the same time that he's just offering the statements to counter Ruta, but knowing also that the statements don't comport with American policy, American actions. So this is sort of like, I don't know if you ever like play chess or whatever, and if you're in a chess tournament and you hear, because people will do this, people will get other people to promote their reputation. If you're going into a chess club competition or something like that, right? They'll get friends to talk about, how good they are, just to psych people out, right? And so this is essentially the flowery nicety version of that, where if you're aware of it, you got to go in and just play your chess game and just get it done, get the job done. So you can't get psyched out with all the flowery rhetoric and the language and the niceties and all those things that the Americans are putting forward. You can use their own rhetoric against them, perhaps, but you certainly shouldn't trust the United States in any way whatsoever. Not a chance. Now, I want to show you one final thing before we head out of this topic. And again, if you get the opportunity, please check out that retweet, because that is a significant point that the United States policy is not matching its rhetoric, and that Vladimir Putin is wise to continue on militarily. But I do want to mention this, that if we think about the U.S. NDAA, the $400 million and the $400 million going to Ukraine, we also have to keep in mind that the United States passed a $1 trillion defense budget at a time when there is no so-called war. And they are killing people without a declaration of war in the seas off the coast of Venezuela. They are also killing people in Somalia. So I want to turn to antiwar.com and give you this. Dave DeCamp. Nothing to see here, just an unprecedented bombing campaign. Anti-war. U.S. launches at least 4 more airstrikes in Somalia as record-shattering bombing campaign continues. The U.S. has launched at least 116 airstrikes in Somalia this year, an unprecedented number. Now, just that should be sufficient for anybody getting together with their family at Christmas time, sitting down at a dinner, coming off of Thanksgiving, all the finery and traditions of so-called Americana or Christian traditions, to say we are slaves to a system that not only is lying to us, but it's killing people while it's lying to us. They promise us a system of constitutionality, a constitution that makes the offices. Then they fill them and they do whatever they want. And it's beyond just handing money to green technologies or buying 10% of a chip manufacturing company or a rare earth smelting company tied to Korea, which we just talked about the other day, that's going to be located in Tennessee. Actually, it's more than 10% that they're going to be getting, the Trump administration. It's more than just that fascist insult. We're talking immediate death while we sit down at dinner. So I was like one or something or whatever when some of the protests, or maybe two or three, when some of the protest stuff was going on Vietnam. And, I met some of the people who went to Canada, and they said, I was not going to be part of that. And when I was a kid, I was told, oh, that's chicken. That's yellow. You're not defending, you're not helping the United States in its grand effort to stop communism and all those things. I heard all that stuff, right? Maybe you heard the same thing. Maybe you had family members who were in the military. They couldn't believe that somebody would not serve their country, right? Well, as we serve dinner, whatever dinner it is over the next few days, there are going to be people who will not be eating dinner or lunch or breakfast or anything. Little kids, they won't be coming down for breakfast. And this is an immediate problem. This is not a problem that is abstract. It's not rhetorical. It's life or death. It's a fist punching a hand over and over and over and over. The United States government is a world criminal. Now let me show you what they're doing to peaceful people in the United States as we talk about the immigration situation.